Imagine a country where the average life expectancy is just 45 years old. Infant mortality is a staggering 200 deaths per 1,000 births. And then fewer than 5% of the people have access to indoor plumbing. In this country, the average person spends about 52% of their income on food. The typical woman walked 148 miles. She carried 36 tons of water every year just to fetch or bring daily water for her family. In this country, the government officials were engaged in corruption. They were taking kickbacks, they were taking bribes from legitimate businessmen, and there were basically gangs that ran big cities and political organizations. This is the United States in the 19th century I just described. Hello and welcome to the Riyadi Club podcast, where entrepreneurs are the real heroes. On this podcast, we discuss tools, concepts, and ideas that are practical and inspirational for the entrepreneur. To learn more, go to www.riyadi.me. That's RIADI.me. Thank you, and I hope you find this episode helpful.
Today, we're going to talk about the 3 kinds of innovations for the entrepreneur or the business owner. So that would give us a summary. What is this all about, and why is it important for the listener? Why should they care?
Hello, Ruba, and hello to the entrepreneur or business owner that's listening to us. And again, the title of the session today is The 3 Kinds of Innovations for the Entrepreneur. So 2 quick things I want to talk about before I dive in. Number 1 is, when I say an entrepreneur, and I'm beginning to use the word business owner a lot because sometimes we don't distinguish, what's an entrepreneur and what's a business owner. And we tend to think that an entrepreneur is, somebody, the founder of Souk or the founder of Tesla or Elon Musk or Steve Jobs or, something like that. An entrepreneur or business owner can be 1 person. It can be 3 people, 30 people, 300 people, 3,000 people. It doesn't really matter. I think in our heads, we're always thinking of the really big guys. And I want to really dispel that myth and basically say, look, there's a lot of really great business owners, really great entrepreneurs that are 2 people, 20 people, small, but have a really big impact. And the term that I love to use to describe these small business owners, these entrepreneurs, is small giants. And I love to focus on what I would call the small or the mid-size entrepreneur and not just the big shot entrepreneurs. And I think my whole mission in life has always been standing up for the small guy. And for me, it's about standing up for the small guy, for the small gal. And for me, it's these small giants. So I love the term small giants. And so that's what I refer to when I'm talking about an entrepreneur, because sometimes people think you've got to be like, Elon Musk or Steve Jobs or the founder of Careem or Souk or, take your pick. Now, with that out of the way, I want to talk about the topic at hand today, which is not all innovations are created equal. When we talk about innovation or innovations, we tend to think in sort of one broad category, but there are actually 3 broad categories, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So 3 categories that fall under innovations or 3 innovation types, and that's really the focus of this. Now, to be fair, these are not my ideas. These come from a book called The Prosperity Paradox by Clayton Christensen. And really, it's a phenomenal book. I love the book. I know I shared a copy with you, Ruba. It's How Innovations Can Lift Nations Out of Poverty. And this author is very well known in Silicon Valley for a different book called The Innovator's Dilemma. So a lot of people are familiar with that book in Silicon Valley. I personally love his other book, and I think it's one of the best books out there. And one of the great examples he uses in this book is a Sudanese British entrepreneur by the name of Muhammad Ibrahim or Mo Ibrahim. Stay on towards the end and I'll share some details about that story. But again, the whole idea here is to talk about these innovations and how you as an entrepreneur or as a business owner can take these things and you can apply that in your personal life, in your business life, and you're going to be amazed. Now, personally, because I studied business and economics in college, I love these kind of things. And I was just blown away by some of the concepts that he has. And not that it's anything earth-shattering, but the way that he organized that was pretty amazing. So I'm going to dive right into it. I'm excited.
Please do. We all are excited. That's the moment we've been waiting for, really.
All right. Well, here, let's start with a simple question. And the question that I'm asking you, Ruba, and I'm asking the listener is, do you remember what life was like before you had a refrigerator? I'll speak for myself. I'm younger, right? Relatively speaking, or depending if you talk to my kids, I'm older. But ever since I was a little boy, I've always had a refrigerator. I've always had a refrigerator. Like, I can't remember the time in my life where I didn't have a refrigerator. The refrigerator now is a lot more expensive than the one that I had when I was a kid, but that's besides the point. And so I ask you, do you remember what life was like before you had a refrigerator? And I'm using a refrigerator as an example, but it could be many, many, many other things out there. So imagine if you had to live your life and you didn't have a refrigerator, right? I don't know. I mean, Ruba, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm guessing you had a refrigerator ever since you were a kid too. Is that right?
Yeah, but we just moved into the new house and we had nothing. There was no fridge for a few days. So yes, I remember very well. Yeah, I remember very well. Life was hard, difficult. You know why? Because you can't just buy food every day. We depend on the fridge. We need to have stuff there, right? So yeah, let me tell you, having a fridge at home is a good feeling. It is. It's a lot of feeling of security because you know that you have it there. But of course, I see your point. We're taking these things for granted. So yeah, most people wouldn't remember what life is without a fridge. Unfortunately, or I don't know, fortunately, I happen to know what is it not to have one.
Yes, but here's the difference. Your situation was temporary.
Yeah, I mean, it was invented. Yeah, I mean, a fridge was invented. But imagine if there was no fridge at all whatsoever. So I would have no way of getting one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that solution wouldn't be there. Yeah.
And I don't know, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, people did not have refrigerators, right? And it might be, depending on your age, your parents, or maybe your grandparents. But take a minute, and I know I keep talking about this point a lot, but I mean, it's amazing that we have a refrigerator and we take it for granted. And what an impact and what a difference it makes for us, right? And I use a refrigerator as an example, but I mean, electricity isn't 100 years old, right? People lived before having electricity, running water or, plumbing in your home, right? And actually, I'll use the UAE as an example, right? Take the UAE 50 years ago and look at the number of people that actually had running water in their home or indoor plumbing versus not, right? It's pretty amazing. And today, if you're listening to this session, you probably have a refrigerator, you have electricity, you have all these things in your home. And my whole point behind that is some other examples that, we take for granted now is like the internet did not exist. There was no internet. I mean, internet today.
Yeah, that's something we remember, I think. That's something we could remember.
Yeah, we're old enough to remember that, but our kids don't. My youngest, she does not know what life was like before a smartphone or an iPad, right? My youngest daughter, she's like, what do you mean? There was no such thing. And then, my older kids, I tell him when I was a little boy, like TV would shut down. Like, there was no TV programming like 24/7, or you couldn't watch on demand.
That is true. Yeah, they had to shut it down, and then they had like the stripes, the different colors. It
exactly.
was like,
Yeah. And Nasheed Al-Watani, and then you shut the TV down.
That was in the 90s. That was in the 90s. That's not such a long time ago. Come on. Are we that
old? So I'm not going to talk about age, but that's okay. So think about laptops and computers, right? Like we use them. We're dependent on them. But again, 50 years ago, they did not exist. Cars, right? Until Henry Ford made it available for everybody, it was just for the super wealthy. Airplanes, until the Wright brothers came up with a flight, 100 years ago, nobody was flying, Smartphones. I mean, look around you. How much time do people spend on their smartphones? Again, 30 years ago, these things did not exist. I'm trying to make a point here. So many of the things that you and I use, that we all use today, did not exist 20 years ago, did not exist 50 years ago, did not exist 100 years ago. And this is one kind of innovation that Clayton, the author of this book, calls it market creating innovation. And this is innovating something that did not exist before. Okay? And I'm going to talk about the two kinds of other innovations in a minute, but I really want to talk about this one first, and I want to make sure I get the point across. A marketing creating innovation is something that did not exist before. The whole idea of non-consumption, people were not consuming that, okay? It did not exist, but now that it exists, everybody has that. Again, let's talk about the smartphone, right? Not every single person, but the vast majority of people in developed countries have a phone. Like, it's actually strange not to see somebody with a smartphone, right? Well, 50 years ago, nobody was walking around with a smartphone. That is a classic example of a market creating innovation. So that's one kind of innovation. And I'm going to talk about the two other ones in a minute. And I have a really fascinating story about a country and the story of innovation for that country. But Ruba, I want to come back to you if there's anything you wanted to add before I talk about this next point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, all these necessities today, we take them for granted. I mean, how could you have a house without a fridge, or how could you not have electricity? But that's absolutely true. One day they did not exist. Somebody invented that. Somebody did the first step, and then somehow these innovations became available for everyone else, and then they became norm.
Yeah.
It's just normal to have these things now.
Let's not go back, 30 years. Let's go back 20 years. Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, Instagram.
Yeah, these are just ventures. These are just products created by people like us.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
YouTube, right? YouTube. I mean, these things that we use, they did not exist and we're consuming them today.
Netflix.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you remember the streaming? Like we used to stream and download and just like do
buffering.
Really, yeah, the buffering takes time. They freeze, yeah. And now we have these inventions because somebody dared to do it.
Yep, absolutely. So again, this is an example of one kind of innovation where you come up with something that did not exist before, and then after that, everybody's consuming that. And I'm going to dive into that and to the others in more detail in a second. But I want to share a story about a country, and I'm not going to name the country. I want you to guess. And Ruba, don't cheat and look at the notes here for a minute.
All right.
Yeah. This is more for the listener.
Guess wrong.
So I want you to, in your head, to try to guess what country this is. So imagine a country where the average life expectancy is just 45 years old. Okay, so people live to be 45 years old. Infant mortality is a staggering 200 deaths per 1,000 births. So out of every 1,000 children that are born, 200 of them die. And then fewer than 5% of the people have access to indoor plumbing. So out of every 100 people, only 5 of those people have indoor plumbing. In this country, in the same country, and again, let's start thinking which country this is, between you and yourself as a listener. This country, the average person spends about 52% of their income on food. So for every, 100 dinars that they earn, they're spending 52 just to eat. There's little help from the government. There's all kinds of corruption in the government. There's all kinds of cronyism and civil service jobs. There's a lot of bribery and things like that. If I were to ask you which poor country this is, what would your guess be? Let me add a couple of other things about this country. The typical woman walked 148 miles. She carried 36 tons of water every year just to fetch or bring daily water for her family. In this country, the government officials were engaged in corruption. They were taking kickbacks, they were taking bribes from legitimate businessmen, and there were basically bosses or gangs that ran big cities and political organizations. And they actually indirectly controlled a lot of city activities and utilities and things like that, city services. If I were to ask you what country this is, try to guess. And I'm curious, Ruba, if you didn't look at the notes, which country do you think this is?
Yeah, I mean, not to offend anyone, but I think I would say it's either a place in Africa or maybe India.
Sure. Okay.
That's what I had in mind as you were describing it.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people might think something similar. And right, we're not trying to offend anybody, right? That's the reality of what goes on in some parts of the world. But what's fascinating, this is the United States in the 19th century I just described.
19th century.
Yeah. So in the 1900s, that was the U.S. Today, we don't see the U.S. that way, right? We see the U.S. in a very different light. And, a lot of the innovations coming out of the U.S. that we just mentioned, Apple, Netflix. And then, when I talk about like water, right? The woman walking 148 miles and 36 tons of water, immediately images from certain countries in Africa in rural areas come up, right? So that's the U.S. in the 19th century. And we don't think about that America was once a poor and a desperate country, and poorer than today than some of the most underdeveloped economies. And the transformation that America had was extraordinary. But I guess, one of the things that people don't realize is you go back and you look, and again, Ruba, you probably never thought about this, and I'm willing to bet the listener never thought that the U.S. was like that.
You wouldn't think about the U.S. as a poor place, yeah?
Yes, because we've never experienced it in our lifetime, right? But in the 19th century, if you go back and you look at the history, that's exactly what it was. And again, some of the really big innovations were the market creating innovations that I talked about. So in spite of being impoverished, in spite of being unregulated and poor infrastructure, America became a fertile territory for scores of innovators and entrepreneurs that saw opportunity, and nobody else saw that. I'm just using America as an example, hopefully as an inspiration for a lot of entrepreneurs and business owners to say, wow, if that was the United States, what can we do with our country, right? Whatever that country is. And so I'm sharing that story that way. And really, it was a lot of the independent entrepreneurs. It was the innovators. And some of the names that I'll put out there is like Isaac Singer, George Eastman, Henry Ford. A lot of these innovators had a really, really, really big impact. And what happened was a lot of the economics where people started doing really better financially had a really big impact, right? And it opened up the states and it opened up the country. Did you know that the US during the 19th century, I think they had like 50 different time zones?
Oof.
Yeah, most people don't know that. So anyways, I use these things as an example because it's really fascinating. And again, you could say South Korea is another example, right? People thought South Korea was a basket case, and you look at South Korea now and it's pretty impressive. And so that's kind of the role that innovation has, and specifically the market creating innovation.
Wasn't China really known for like the bad quality?
Yes.
Everything that comes from China, Japan.
Yeah, exactly.
Look at these countries. Think about Singapore, right?
Yeah. If they did it, why can't anybody else do that, right?
Exactly.
So,
Let alone Emirates. Think about
Yeah.
Emirates is the most recent, I think, example that's in our lifetime. But the US, to think about the US being such a poor country, though it is in the 19th century, but that time there were other rich countries. So it's not like everyone was poor. There were some rich countries. It wasn't one of them. That's a very interesting way to think of it.
Yeah, and we may want to have a separate session on that whole thing because it's so fascinating. You can dive into some of the details on that. I want to get the point across that the U.S. wasn't as wealthy and as prominent as it always has been, contrary to what we might think, right? It was a poor country. They had a lot of corruption. They had a lot of problems. All right, so back to the three types of innovations. And again, this is, from the book of The Prosperity Paradox. So the innovation number one that we talked about is the market creating innovation. And that's exactly what the name implies. They create new markets, but not just any new markets. They create new markets that serve people who either no products existed or these products were not affordable or accessible for many different reasons. And let me give you an example. The original iPhone was a market creating innovation. Originally, right? There was no such market for it. And then Apple came out with that. Steve Jobs came out with that. And what did they do? Everybody wanted an iPhone after that, right? And then other companies copied that and came out with a smartphone. Another example is, as I mentioned earlier, Muhammad Ibrahim or Mo Ibrahim, the Sudanese British entrepreneur who went and he founded a telecom company in Africa when none of the big telecom companies wanted to get in there and none of the investors wanted to get in there because, again, it was corrupt. There was a lot of things going on. And I'll dive into this story more later on. But what he essentially did is he created a market for people to make phone calls and to start using mobile phones where they didn't exist for it before, right? These people were too poor to be considered that they would really use a phone. And I'll talk more about that later on. So that's one type of innovation. The other type of innovation is what's called sustaining innovation. And sustaining innovations are improvements to existing solutions on the market, and they're typically targeted to customers who need better performance from a product or service. And what I mean by that is like Lipton tea, right? When I was a kid, I think there was only one flavor. Right? And now you go in and you look and there's like 20, 30 different kinds of Lipton teas that are out there, right? So that's sustaining innovation. Another example is like a car, right? I mean, a car came out, but now you have a sunroof and you've got heated leather seats and you've got this and you've got that. So you're sustaining innovation, right? The iPhone in the beginning was a market creating innovation, but with time, it became a sustaining innovation. They're just improving on that same iPhone again and again and again. So number one, the market creating innovation. Number two is a sustaining innovation. Now, number three is an efficiency innovation. Exactly like the name implies, that enables companies to do more with fewer resources. So let me give you an example of what that looks like. And this really applies to a lot of countries where there's natural resources. So efficiency innovation, the classic place is like in a factory, right? If a factory invests in automation, now you need a lot less people to get that work done. You can get a lot more work done and you have less people. So you can increase your output, but you can decrease the number of employees. So that's that third type of innovation. So again, I just want to recap really quick. Number one, market creating innovation. Number two, sustaining innovation. Number three, efficiency innovation. And those are kind of broadly the three types of innovations that are out there. And they're all really good innovations. The market creating innovation is the one that has a really big impact on jobs and on elevating a country out of poverty or a nation out of poverty. And again, if you find this interesting and you want to go in and you want to read more about this, the title of the book is The Prosperity Paradox. So anyways, Ruba, I get really excited about this. So I'll stop, I'll pause, I'll come back to you. And then I think I want to talk about some of the insights of what we just talked about.
Yeah, it's interesting that the market creating innovation, the products or the services, they reach a maturity level and then they become sustaining innovation because you've already created this product or maybe a service that is mature enough that you just start on improving at it, but you're clear on the base. And then the efficiency innovation, can we say like platforms that has changed the world, for example, Google, is that an efficiency innovation? Because they basically just replaced encyclopedias and created so much opportunities. Would that be considered more of a market creating innovations, right? Because it's new.
Yeah, I think it's a market creating innovation because it's new. It didn't exist before. But another example of efficiency innovation is countries with oil, right? You need a lot less people to have a lot more output of oil. So in the beginning, you probably leveraged a lot more people. But as you use more automation, as you use more mechanical things, and again, I don't have a lot of expertise in this area, what happens is you need a lot less people to do that. So even if you look in countries and, take a pick of a country that has a lot of oil output, the employment percentage of people that are employed is a small percentage compared to marketing creating innovations. And to be fair, they're all really good types of innovations, but the ones that really create a lot of employment and have a really big impact and is the market creating innovations. That's one of the things that's got a really big impact that elevates a lot of people, because you can have a wealthy nation that's not prosperous, and those nations do exist, right? Because there's a difference between wealth and prosperity. But that's kind of how I would use the efficiency innovation, right? You're becoming more efficient, you can have more output, but you don't need as many people to do that because you have automation in place. You've got better systems, better mechanics, better things of that sort. So that's what I mean by that.
Okay, got it. Something like the self-check-in for Amazon, for example, in the supermarkets, or the check-in in the airports.
All right, I want to share some insights about these different kinds of innovations. And I'm probably going to focus a lot on what I would call market creating innovations. And again, I think what you can do with these insights as a listener, you learn from them and you say, wow, can I do this in my business, or can I even do it in my life and do something like that? So one of the things that Clayton talks about in this book, and he says, we see non-consumption and its enormous potential. We see non-consumption as having enormous potential. And what he means by that is a lot of innovations and a lot of things that are going to come out, you're going to come out with something that people are not consuming that right now, right? And again, I use the example of a refrigerator as a really basic example. Prior to that, nobody was consuming that, right? Now that everybody's consuming that, you can scale it and the price comes down big time, right? And take your pick and, whatever that is. And one of the interesting things that Clayton talks about in this book too is that the emerging markets have a lot more opportunity to create these new markets that can yield significant returns. And because in these emerging markets, there's a lot more opportunity where you can find non-consumers, right? So a lot of times there's a perception of, hey, let me come up with an innovation for the rich in the advanced countries. Hey, nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. But What if you came up with an innovation where an average person or even a poor person can afford that, right? Or even a really poor person can afford that, right? That is an example of non-consumption because now it's available to everybody. And Clayton uses a ton of examples in his book. The other thing that he talks about, and I think this is really fascinating, and this might seem counterintuitive, but the research shows that enduring prosperity for a lot of countries is not going to come from fixing poverty. And what he means by that is alleviating poverty is not the same as creating prosperity. And we need to start thinking differently. Alleviating poverty is not the same as creating prosperity. And he uses an example where a nonprofit goes and, they put a well in the middle of a rural area in some country in Africa. And, there's a lot of hype and media attention the first year where they open it up. You go back there 3 years later and the well is closed off, right? It's not working anymore. They can't maintain it. It's really expensive. Whereas a small independent entrepreneur that has found another way of doing something that's profitable, that's sustainable, can actually continue to be in business and generate revenue, and that is an ongoing prosperity. And he uses Muhammad Ibrahim as an example with the whole telecom thing, right? He created that on a large scale, but he uses many other small examples. So these are some of the insights, that I found fascinating. Anyways, I want to talk about a couple of other insights, but I want to come back to you.
Yeah, this is interesting. As you're speaking, I'm thinking about few things because it is one thing to hear about the different types of innovation, but it's something else to implement it in your business or come up with an idea that is non-consumption. How would you do that? The idea is terrifying. The fact that you're sharing this, that they're sharing this, they've written this book about it, it really helps to break through the fear. But I see few challenges with the non-consumption because you're creating a totally new demand, creating a totally new market. There is a very high risk that it wouldn't work. And then if you are to create it for the rich with a high cost, right, you start to scale it. That's one way to do it. And I think it's probably the easier way than to create it and have it accessible for everyone, because this means that you really need to control the cost of creation, right? You need to really control it. You need to really be creative. This is just such a big idea. I see so many challenges in that. You need to be very creative. I feel like you need to be very creative to do it, or maybe it can just happen as an accident by chance. You have all these ideas and then one day it clicks.
Yeah, well, it's really fascinating. He shares some things there that as an entrepreneur or as a business owner, you can learn and you can apply. And obviously, like anything, you can test the waters. But he used some very, very, very specific examples of how the Japanese got into the US market with Honda as an example, Honda motorcycles, right? So for people that don't know, the Harley Davidson is an American motorcycle, that really big, loud one, the biker dudes are riding. And in the beginning, Honda was trying to compete with Harley Davidson, right? So they came up with these motorcycles and this and that. And, they were losing. These motorcycles were not good. They were terrible. It wasn't the American brand, But by pure coincidence, they saw that somebody was riding like the Honda motorcycle off-road, right? Like in a mountain and stuff like that. And so they, by pure coincidence, they went and they said, well, let's create motorcycles for like the average person in Asia, so just they can get around, so they can commute, right? Just cheap, basic motorcycle, not these expensive ones. And then what happened is they leveraged that technology for like off-roading, and then Honda became dominant in that space. Same thing with Samsung, and I can't remember, it was appliances, right? They were trying to compete with like the American manufacturers, and by pure coincidence, they made just cheap stuff so it's affordable for everybody in China or in South Korea. And it was like the cheap microwaves, right? And then they became dominant. And so you look at all these examples, and it's actually pretty amazing. And I'll give you an example of something today that many people may not know about that I think is fascinating. Just so that the listener knows, I spent time between the Middle East and the United States. And the app, WhatsApp, right? Or WhatsApp, as it's commonly called. I use it, I love it, and it's very commonly used around the world. But in the US and Canada, you would be shocked at how many people do not use it.
Yeah, that was really shocking to me.
Yeah.
When Carla told me it's not common, I was like, what?
I have my family on it, because we're in different countries and friends and, all over. And
Right.
WhatsApp is like so critical to what I do. But I have friends that are in the US and Canada that don't even know what WhatsApp is and they don't use it and they have no need for it, right? But holy moly, I
Mm,
can't live without it. And I know you can't live without it, right? Like a lot of us that, yeah.
absolutely. And now that we're talking about it, I remember when WhatsApp became popular. I remember it because it was just few years ago. And how did we live before that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Crazy,
It's
yeah.
phenomenal, fascinating, right? And if you look at one of the things that happened in Lebanon, one of the things that caused a lot of the riots was the government was trying to tax WhatsApp, right? And so imagine there's a whole thing happening because of taxes on WhatsApp, right? And things like that. So really, really, really fascinating. But here's an example of a market innovation, right? A market creating innovation that did not exist 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And now we're so dependent on that every single day. And it's not targeted to the US consumer or to the Canadian consumer, right? It's actually targeted for a lot of other people, probably for people that have,
Higher rates for messaging, maybe.
well, different countries, right? Yeah. Fascinating, right? You never thought about WhatsApp that way.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's also fascinating because it could happen either ways. Either it's a need that this product fulfills, like WhatsApp, for example, people wanted to communicate, but the communication was too expensive. The ISPs were too expensive. The messaging is too expensive. There is no like voice over IP. So WhatsApp came up with this. Now it's
Yeah.
Facebook, but anyway, that company, I don't know who created WhatsApp. So let's say it's a
Yeah.
WhatsApp company.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they came up with this product that really fulfilled a need that people had. If they realized it or not, that was a need that was there. And if you compare it to the iPhone did not fulfill a need. It just created a totally new need, like for the experience. For we had Blackberries, right? Like I remember when iPhones became so popular. Before that, we had the Blackberries, and it was a
Yep.
totally different experience.
Yeah. Yeah. But Apple came with a totally new category, right? You had a GPS
Absolutely.
built in, you had a whole bunch of things like that. But to WhatsApp, I mean, holy moly, man. I remember, not like 10 years ago, I would fly, from Chicago to Ramallah. And I'm like, man, I have a Palestinian phone and then a Jordanian one and an American one. And it's like, what a nightmare, right? And you're like, hang on, which one is which? And you're carrying multiple
Then we
phones.
changed the SIM
Yeah,
card.
just ridiculous,
Yeah.
right? And now I'm like, hey, here's my WhatsApp. I don't care. Call me, wherever I am, right? It's just fascinating. And so,
Absolutely.
I mean, I love it. I'm addicted and I can't imagine life without that, right? I'm talking to my parents on it all the time and, chats and things like that. But fascinating. And I use that as a case in point that I think there's an advantage in developing countries to come up with these kind of innovations because necessity is the mother of all innovation or inventions, right? الحاجة أم الاختراع. Did I translate that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
So it's really, really, really amazing and, fascinating. I'll give you another example and then, Ruba, I'll come back to you. But as a kid, I used to go between the US and the Middle East every 4 years or so. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that Starbucks, Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks, this whole Starbucks thing in the US did not exist. He actually was in Italy and he saw how the Italians drink coffee and, how they treat coffee. And he said, you know what? I want to bring that whole thing to the United States. And that did not exist in the US prior to that. So Starbucks, really, Howard Schultz, the whole idea was from the Italians. And it's funny because I remember as a kid, and I wasn't a coffee drinker as a kid, I would drink tea. But what's fascinating is when I was in Ramallah, I understood as a kid that there was Turkish coffee, there was Arabic coffee, there was American or filtered coffee, there was European coffee. Like you sort of understood these things. I didn't drink any of them. But then when I was in the US, I only remember there was really only one kind of coffee. And I was in the Midwest, when I was in the US, Minnesota, Illinois, those areas. And even as a kid, I was aware that, oh my goodness, I have all these different kind of coffees when I am in Ramallah, but I don't have those kind of coffees when I'm in the US. And it's just fascinating because I never gave it some thought. And here's what happened. Starbucks, because you can get ideas from other places and you can apply that. So Starbucks went and got the idea from, Howard Schultz from the Italians, brought it to the US and capitalized on that. Now, this is an example of non-consumption on the other side, on the higher end, right? I don't know. When I was a kid, there was no Starbucks. You got that crappy coffee.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. Those things, they suddenly start being so popular. Remember when Starbucks became popular?
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
remember it. And you know what's interesting? During the MBA, I remember it was fascinating for me to just realize that McDonald's is not in the burger industry. It is in the real estate industry. And Starbucks is not in the coffee industry. It's about the experience. It's all about the experience. And it was just shocking for me because for me, it seems like Starbucks, the whole business model seems to me that it's around coffee. But now that you're mentioning that they brought it from Italy, and we all know how Italians love their coffee. They sit for hours and they talk about it, and they're like, it's made like this, and they really enjoy their coffee. It is interesting that you're mentioning that. Now I remember that, yeah, we studied this. We studied that, yeah, Starbucks is about the experience. It's about the experience you go through when you sit in a Starbucks cafe. You have the internet. They always ask you like 100 questions. Which type do you want? You need to kind of speak this Starbucks language. But yeah, that's the difficult part. But nevertheless, they created this culture. You could either see like you're either a Starbucks person or you're not a Starbucks person. You speak the Starbucks language. You go there, you sit, yeah, it is very interesting. And yeah, we see a lot of possibilities of stuff that worked in a different country, and you can copy it. You can get inspired by it and apply it in a different, maybe customize it a little bit, localize it a little bit, and risk it and try it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to recap the 3 types of innovations, and then I want to share the story of Muhammad Ibrahim. And then we can go ahead and you can add whatever else you want, Ruba, and then we can go ahead and sign off. But so again, the 3 types of innovations. Number 1 is a market creating innovation. That's where you create a new market where none existed before. Number 2 is the sustaining innovation, and that's where you come up with leather seats for the car or 20 different flavors of Lipton tea. And then number 3 is efficiency innovation. That's where you do more with less. And this is where, you've got a factory and now you have a lot more automation. So you can have a lot more output with the same amount of people or even less people. So those are kind of like the 3 different types of innovations that are out there that the author talked about. Now, the story of Muhammad Ibrahim, the Sudanese British entrepreneur, I want to share that with the listener because really it's very inspirational and it's very practical. And I think it applies to anybody who is an entrepreneur, small or big. And to be fair, Muhammad Ibrahim is, a multimillionaire and did really, really well. I think, Ruba, you probably know him, more about him than I do.
He's well known. The Sudanese are happy when someone Sudanese does something. He becomes a superstar. Yeah, did you know that he's Sudanese? This becomes the topic.
That's right. So Muhammad Ibrahim, Mo Ibrahim, in the late 1990s, what he did is he set up a mobile phone company in Africa, and people told him he was nuts.
That was the 90s, David. Do you remember how we had, there was like this big box. The mobile phones were not like that. Do you remember them? The first mobile phone was the big one in a big bag. It was in the cars.
Yes. Yeah. I know. Yeah. And there's the brick, Michael Jordan had like the first brick cell phone that was kind of a little bit portable. And So it was in the early days of cell phones. The kids these days, they have no idea what that is. You guys, if you're listening, you have to go and Google that. But basically, there was no mobile phones in Africa for sort of the poor or the average person, right? And the problem was, the big telecom companies in the US and Europe, Japan and other parts of the world were really focused on, the richer countries, right? The countries that had more money. And when they looked at Africa, Africa was, you had different countries, there was corruptions, there was no infrastructure. There was really a lot of challenges in doing this in Africa. And I'm kind of taking some of these statements out of the book. And everybody said that Africa is a basket case, he says. It's a dangerous place. It's full of dictators. It's full of crazy people who are all corrupt. And actually, some people laughed at his idea when he shared his idea. So the investors, the banks, the telecom companies, they all saw poverty. They all saw risk. They saw corrupt government and many other problems. Mo Ibrahim saw opportunities. To his credit, he saw the whole thing differently. Instead of seeing poverty, he saw opportunity. Here's a little bit from the book, and this is what he said. So if you're in Africa, far away from the village where your mother lives, and you want to talk to her, you might have to make a 7-day journey, Ibrahim recalls now. If you could just pick up a device and speak to her instantly, how much value would that be? How much money would you save? How much time would you save? Notice Ibrahim did not say how many millions of Africans for whom 3 meals a day is often a luxury can afford a mobile phone, nor did he justify the investments in infrastructure that did not exist. He focused on the struggle to accomplish something important for which there were few good solutions. For Ibrahim, this struggle represented enormous potential. So to his credit, he saw it differently. He saw opportunity. He did not see poverty. And so this whole story is really fascinating. And I want to leave the listener with really an inspirational quote, an amazing and an inspirational quote by Hamad Ibrahim. But before I do that, Ruba, I want to turn back to you because I think you might know more about this guy than I do. So if there's anything else you wanted to share, and then I want to leave the listener with a quote by Mo Ibrahim.
I hate to disappoint you, David, but I just know him as a name. Hate to disappoint you. I'm Sudanese, but no.
You're not related to him or anything like
that, I'm not related to him, unfortunately.
He's not your uncle or anything like that, huh?
No, and for me, the idea is still crazy because I'm one of the people that I'm not going to go and invest my money, in a corrupted place. And I guess that's why he's a multi-millionaire, or maybe he's even a billionaire. I don't know, because he saw the risk, he went for it, and he doesn't have the fear of the, ordinary people. He made his money. That's how he made his money, right?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. And for the listener, like if any of these stories, or if you want to learn more, go get the book. The author shares many, many, many other stories, and he shares many other key insights and nuggets, that you can leverage. So that's something, that I would do. So, but yeah, I guess, Ruba, I want to share with the listener the quote, and then I'll turn it to you to add anything else, and then you can sign off. Sounds good?
All right, sure.
All right. This is what Mo Ibrahim said, and this is his quote in that book. "It's not an easy thing to be laughed at by serious people. And serious people laughed at me when I told them I wanted to build a telecommunications network in Africa 20 years ago. They told me all the reasons the project would never succeed. Somehow I just kept on thinking, I know there are challenges, but why can't they see the opportunity? Somehow I just kept thinking, I know there are challenges, but why can't they see the opportunity?" And this is what Mo Ibrahim shared. And I read this every single time, and I am amazed because he did it on a massive scale. Sometimes we struggle to even do that on a small scale, right? Sometimes somebody makes fun of our idea and, we want to go cry in a corner or something. And it's pretty impressive to see what he has done and what he's accomplished.
He held to it. He went and he's done it regardless of the risk. I'm going to research him because I'll be really curious to know how did he get over the corruption and all the other challenges? Because I've seen so many people getting robbed in Africa. And this is the more stereotype idea, right? I see a lot of entrepreneurs, maybe I know about 4 or 5. They always say Africa is the future, and then they go and then they invest and they lose it all. It's a different culture. Politics are different. The corruption is crazy. Yeah, there's so many creative ways to rob people of their money. But I'll be very interested to know how did he do it. And I think that's why he's distinguished, because he's done things that not everyone can do. He's done something very special. Yeah.
And a classic example of somebody who, focused on the first kind of innovation we talked about, which is market creating innovations, right?
Absolutely.
This little old lady in the village in the middle of nowhere, Africa, can now make a call or get a call from her son, it takes him 7 days, to walk there to see her, right? And now it's a phone call. And that's a ton of value, for that. And obviously, I'm simplifying it now, but that's the point. Think of this as the appetizer for the meal, right? This is the appetizer. Go get the book, and you can get the full meal in the book.
That's a very good appetizer. It is so interesting. One of the main things that I see in this book is that you beat the fear, right? So you beat the fear because you realize that some other people have done it, and they've done it differently, and that the mainstream of thinking risk and thinking business, this is not necessarily always right. It's not what we study in university. It's not the mainstream. It's not the common thing. Some people have done it their way, right? So for me, this was a very bold message. Another question that comes to mind is how to apply this in real life. And there are two approaches always. There is the bottom up and there is the down. There's the bottom up and there is the top down. So either, kind of like the work frame, you think, okay, I'm going to do this type of innovation, and you start to think about a product or a service, or you have this at the back of your mind and you just go and try to do something differently outside the game. There was this guy, David, and I would try to find him up and I will try to remember his name. I want to add this. I'll share it with you later. Maybe we could add his name to the episode notes. And he was saying that it's not about thinking outside the box, but it's about thinking in a completely different box. And he was talking about the advantage of being from a totally different background and starting something in a completely new. His name is Naveen something. I'll try to look him up. He was talking about that, the advantage of coming from a completely different background and doing something for the first time in a new industry, and not to think about how people are doing it within that industry, even though you don't recognize how they're doing it because you are from a different industry, but you bring your experience with you to the new industry. And I think that is maybe an advantage to creativity, because we are often tied up by what we know. And a lot of the times, if we experience something that we don't know with total freedom, someone who doesn't know will have less fear than somebody who knows, right?
Yeah, I think you're referring to the Indian entrepreneur that lives in the U.S. Naveen is his name, and he's involved in like a lot of healthcare and things like that, space and healthcare and things like that. Yeah, he's a really, really big shot entrepreneur. Yeah.
He is, but I can't remember his last name. When he said that, he shocked me. It really resonated with me because he says, it's not about thinking outside the box, because a lot of people will go and understand what are the norms in the market and then try to come up with something different. And I've always found that difficult. Like, if you have to understand, they always say you have to understand the game and then you have to break it or change it. But he was just saying, you guys go and play a different game in a different in a different field. I mean, how amazing is that? I'll look up his name.
I love that guy, and I've heard him speak, so we'll add him to the show notes. We'll add that link to the show notes and do that. So absolutely. So all right, sounds good. Well, listen, I know we can probably talk forever, Ruba, because this type of stuff is exciting, but I think one of us needs to sign off, and we'll save some stuff for our next session.
Absolutely. This is not only interesting, I feel like this is refreshing, David, because this is the stuff that we need to keep at least at the back of our minds. This is the stuff that keeps us open to new ideas and kind of like, you say something crazy and then someone criticizes you and you kind of like cry in the corner. And a lot of people are like that. And for the silliest ideas, right? So knowing that people have done it, they've done it their way, they've done it differently, and it works. This is satisfying, and absolutely love this. And thank you for bringing this for today's session. So with that, we will leave you. So thank you for listening to this program of Riyadi Club, where entrepreneurs are the real heroes. And don't forget, you have something in this world, so rise up.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Riyadi Club podcast. And remember, you have something in this world, so rise up. If you want us to cover a specific topic, or if you'd like to be a guest on our podcast, go to www.riyadi.me. That's RIADI.me. Thank you and have a great day.